Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Planet Pulse Pacific podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm coming to you from Darrinbal country in Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. Finally, if you find value in this podcast, please share it with a friend to help us get the word out, or consider buying us a coffee if you'd like to help support our work.
We are very excited to have a return guest from way back, episode 14 in season 1. Not only was this one of our more popular episodes, but an emotional one too, as I recalled recently a listener writing to us that she was listening to the episode whilst driving and had to pull over as she was in tears, hearing the horrific detailed stories of the deforestation in Queensland. We're not making any promises as to what direction this chat will take us, but we do know that this will be another hugely insightful one.
Today, we're sitting down with Gerard Wedderburn-Bisshop, co-founder and lead scientist at the World Preservation Foundation. As Ben mentioned, this is Gerard's second time on our show, so if you're new to his work, please do yourself a favour and go back and listen to his first episode with us in addition to this one. Gerard has a very impressive background, including work as a principal scientist with the Queensland Government, where he worked in the field of remote sensing. Over the course of 2 decades, he witnessed 4% of the world's deforestation firsthand right here at home on our doorstep. He's also the author of several journal articles and book chapters, and today we'll be catching up with Gerard for an update on his latest projects, including a deep dive into his newest scientific paper, which advocates for consistent carbon accounting. So Gerard, thank you so much for joining us once again on the podcast.
Thank you kindly, Emma and Ben. It's a great pleasure to be back. I'm really happy to promote my last paper. It's a bit dry, accounting, but I think it's fascinating.
Now, just to set the scene for a lot of our newer listeners, as Emma mentioned, you had spoken about witnessing, and this was one of so many mind-blowing figures, 4% of the world's deforestation over a 20-year period. Across Queensland specifically. At the time, when we last spoke to you 4 years ago, you were the principal scientist with the Queensland Government Department. Can you just remind us, or just to recap, what some of those figures are, what's changed since? Because I think it's really important to understand the enormity of the challenges that we're currently going through.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. The Wilderness Society are doing great work monitoring deforestation in Australia, and Queensland is deforestation central in Australia, but it's spreading now. It's Northern Territory is going gangbusters, Western Australia, and in New South Wales it's also increasing. We were monitoring deforestation for decades, back since the Landsat satellite first started, the late 80s. And over that period, and it's still going strong, we were witnessing in Queensland 11 square kilometres per day cleared, destroyed, and 93% of that was for grassland, for grazing industries. So what we were seeing is something like 10 square kilometres a day. That's 2,500 acres per day, several suburbs worth of bushland clearing per day. No one sees it. It's out of sight, out of mind, out in the bush. But thankfully, people are starting to point at this now. And in fact, the latest legislation in the European Union is that they want deforestation-free imports. So one of those things is Australian beef. So Australian beef needs to be deforestation free, and they're arguing the finer points about it now, which is wonderful to see, because it's devastating for the environment. There was one report from Victoria that showed the colony of koalas that were just trashed with the trees. The contractor who was ripping the trees out didn't even know they were there. And this is what happens with wildlife. If you take away their habitat, you kill them. Some birds can get away with it. They can maybe there's a crop that they can eat that substitutes, but territory is everything to wildlife. So if you take away habitat for one group of wildlife, they're dead because they can't go next door because that's habitat for another group of wildlife. So it's these ecosystems are so essential for our future, and we're just trashing them. That attitude that nature is there for us to take, natural resource, the name of the department I was working for, natural resources, assumes that these are things that man can just take without any repercussions. Well, the repercussions are hitting us right now in the form of biodiversity loss. We're in the midst of the sixth great extinction, and also in the form of climate change. Everyone has felt that or knows someone who's felt that right now. So these are crunch times, and thank God that you're promoting this sort of interest, because it's so important that we change what we do.
And this might lead us nicely into your work with the award-winning documentary Eating Our Way to Extinction. So could you tell us a little bit about that project and your involvement in it? And I also believe there's now a bit of a summary version available for people who are time poor.
Yes, exactly. Eating Our Way to Extinction, Kate Winslet has a beautiful voice, and the voiceover she did for that was just brilliant. That's been edited down now to about half the length, about 35 minutes, and it's still a really impactful documentary. It's in about 19 different languages now, and it's been, the voiceover is done by a local celebrity. They've been very good at leveraging celebrity for it. But that documentary tells the story of how we impact Mother Earth through our food choices, and it's a great story, but not enough people heard that story, unfortunately. So anyway, it's still available. It's on YouTube, free of charge, the longer and the shorter version, and in different languages. So it's a really good thing to see. It's still leading edge. It's still highly current. And there's also a book that goes with that, which is the environmental and health impacts of animal agriculture, and that's still fresh. And they tell me eventually I might get some royalties from it.
That'd be nice.
But yeah, that was Eating Our Way to Extinction, and we hope to do some shorter single topic discussions, documentaries in the future, infographics maybe, but none of that's arranged yet. So yes, we've moved on from that.
Now, we're full of segues at the moment, because this leads on to another little side note. You, we believe, are now a scientific endorser of the plant-based treaty, of which we're a general endorser. I think we have been, the Lethal Intervention, for a number of years, and we proudly display the logo on our website. But tell us a little bit about your role with that.
Well, yeah. Kat Lawrence is one of these powerhouse women. She contacted me a couple of months ago and made the effort of coming and talking to me, and it was a discussion that went on for hours. But yeah, the plant-based treaty are hitting goals. They're just doing such great work in this space, getting the message out. It's actually really funny because I used to give a presentation. I've given different presentations for the last 15 years, but one of the very first presentations, I called it Eat Plants and Plant Trees. Now, that's now the logo or the catchphrase of the plant-based treaty. So I'm hopefully...
Hopefully you're getting royalties on that too.
Oh, yeah, actually, don't tell them. They might have that trademark. Yeah, so plant-based treaty are doing great stuff. I'm so impressed with these guys, but they're one of many, and I think what that shows to me is that the tide is turning. We've ignored the big issues on planet Earth and our future. Like, I've got 6 grandkids now, so what sort of future do they have? If I want a future for them, we've got to make some hard decisions about how we use our precious land, how we use how can we feed them for a start, but how can we get by and not wipe out the wildlife populations upon which we depend. If there's no biodiversity, there's no humans on the planet. So it's so important to us. Climate, biodiversity, they're the 2 biggies at the moment, but there's planetary boundaries. We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries now. And what's the biggest driver of 5 of those is agriculture. So the 6th that agriculture wasn't said to be the biggest driver is climate change, believe it or not. And that's the topic of today's talk. So after this, you'll realise, it might be the biggest driver of that planetary boundary as well. So, there's all these things that are impacting our future and our kids' future. So this is the time, and I'm so glad that there's all these organisations out there. It's a roller coaster. It's the tide has turned, as I see it. And even though the numbers following the plant-based diet are still small, it's an exponential curve that we're on. So you look back and you think nothing's happening, but you look forward and you look at this mountain and you think, will we ever get there? And yes, I believe so, because it's exponential, and the tide's turning, but the majority has not caught on yet, but they will, and so we'll see a different world in it's got to be in the next decade.
All right. So, I mean, as we've mentioned, you've been busy writing scientific papers again, which, is never the easiest of tasks. So before we get into the nitty and gritty of your paper, Deforestation, a Call for Consistent Carbon Accounting, what motivated you to pick up the pen again, so to speak, and challenge the conventional carbon accounting methods used in emission reporting rather than just enjoying time with your grandkids?
But we highly appreciate it, though.
Yes, very thankful.
Yeah, that's right. Don't get me wrong, I love my grandkids, and they are such beautiful people. They are just, our youngest is 2 years old, and he's got he's a delight. And the oldest is a teenager now, so they're all delights. They really are. But yeah, when I left government, I was contacted to help out with a report which Beyond Zero Emissions was doing at the time, called the Land Use Plan. And I was sort of headhunted for that. And what that entailed was going through Australia's accounts, our greenhouse accounts, to detail exactly what was an agricultural emission. It was all about land use and agriculture. So up until now, the United Nations guidelines, the rules, the conventions that control all of the climate accounting, they've separated out agriculture and land use. Well, to me, that's the most muddle-headed thing you could have done. I mean, it was difficult at the time, I'll grant you that. We didn't know the land use emissions to the degree that we know them now. But by separating those two out, what we've done is we've downplayed agriculture and land use, for that matter. We've separated them. So yes, when we talk about emissions for Australia's beef production, for example, we look at methane basically, and we look at a few emissions, quite a few emissions from this savanna burning up in the northern half of Australia, which doesn't even count the carbon dioxide, believe it or not. And then we look at land use separately over here, and then we do a net trickery, skullduggery accounting business, which I'll get into, to minimise that. So this work with Beyond Zero Emissions, we dug into that. We dug into that detail. And I teased out, and Australia, all the data's there. It's just that we play trickery with the accounting, but all the data's there. Thankfully, thank Australian government for that. So I teased it out. I got all the data and I included the gross emissions from deforestation, and I included the gross emissions from all these other land use things that were net. And when you do that, I discovered that using everything else conventional, except that we use the full emission for deforestation, I found that at the time, agriculture, all of agriculture all of agriculture was said to be between 16 and 20% of Australian emissions. Okay, so that's it, 16 to 20% of Australian emissions. But when you do the sums properly, I worked out it was 42%. So it was more than double the emissions when you count it properly. And I was scratching my head about this for many years, to answer your question, and finally got back to the point where, no, we're still doing it that way. We're still doing this dodgy accounting, and it's still minimising the impact of agriculture, particularly the things causing deforestation, which is mostly animal agriculture. So I cottoned on to a guy called Sailesh Rao, who's started a group called Climate Healers, and he started off with Al Gore, and then realised no. If we want to treat climate change, we must include agriculture. So he went away, wrote a couple of books, and I read the book, great books, and all sorts of new ideas. But at the heart of it, he was saying that animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change. And deep down, I knew that to be the case. So and he's been belted around the ears. Everyone's ignored him. And they go back to what's animal agriculture's emissions? They go back to the FAO industry-driven figure, which is 14.5% of global emissions. And it's the safety thing. All of the NGOs, all the environmental NGOs, even the plant-based advocates, they fall back to this FAO 14.5% of global emissions because it's safe. They can get criticised otherwise. So I knew this to be wrong. So a couple of years ago, and it's taken that long, I decided, right, let's do a proper science job in the top journals, get it peer-reviewed thoroughly, so there's no question, and then we can change the narrative on animal agriculture's climate impact. So that's the segue. That's how I got to where I am.
Can I just say I really like your conflict of interest statement at the end, saying you're biased against industrial scale deforestation. I mean, gosh, what a terrible thing to be biased against. But maybe could we just kind of start with the basics here for people that are listening and trying to wrap their heads around this. So currently there's two different methods utilised. So there's net versus gross accounting, and you've just explained that land use and land use change and forestry use net assessment. So what's the difference here, and why are they allowed to actually use that rather than gross?
Okay, well, the concept is actually really quite simple, and it's this: the two biggest sources of carbon dioxide. I'm going to use the word carbon, but I mean carbon dioxide. The two biggest sources of carbon are fossil fuels and deforestation, and land use. Deforestation makes up 3/4 of the land use emissions, so I'll call it deforestation. Okay, so they're the two biggest sources, fossil fuels and deforestation. Now, how do we count those emissions? When we burn fossil fuels, we account for the full emission. Okay, makes sense? We do the sums on how many litres of fuel are burnt, therefore how much carbon dioxide has entered the atmosphere. Sounds simple? Okay. When it comes to deforestation, we take a totally different approach. We say, okay, we know the full emission, okay, so we count the full emission from the deforestation, and then we say, but over there's trees that are regrowing, and those trees are soaking up quite a bit of the carbon dioxide that we've released. So let's just take the difference, because it's the difference that stays in the atmosphere that affects the climate. Now, that's actually logical. It makes sense, but it's totally inconsistent with the way we treat fossil fuels, because with fossil fuels, exactly the same thing happens. When we burn fossil fuels, most of that carbon is soaked up by vegetation. It's locked down, not just cycled, it's locked down, most of it. Okay, so we've got the same process happening, fossil fuels and deforestation, but we're counting it quite differently. It's strange that it came about that way, but you can see the logic in how they derived it. But that's never been questioned. To me, that's so overdue for questioning that it's ridiculous. I mean, I don't have a career in science to jeopardise, so I don't care. But some people might, and it was really interesting, the reaction I got from this paper. I contacted the leading lights in the carbon accounting field, and several of them got back to me straight away with, yes, you're right. And we're going to bring it up at the next meeting of the global carbon budget. So there are people, and by the way, it's not just me who's realised this, it's a lot of other people, particularly in the biodiversity field. There have been some Professor Mackey, Griffith University, and Heather Keith, also Griffith, now RMIT, I think. They've written reports about it. We're doing this wrong. We've got to use full accounting for the whole lot. We fully account for fossil fuels. Let's fully account for deforestation. And when you do that, it makes a big difference.
Regular guest of ours, Dr. Mike Joy, always likes to remind us that planting a tree replaces the tree that was there before, and that generally fossil fuels is being added to the cycle. It's a new addition, and it's always quite important to remember that. Now, in regards to the land use change and forestry land use reporting, why is it that they use the net assessment? Why? I mean, we talk about accounting gymnastics, accounting trickery, and so on. What are they trying to hide? What are they trying to? I mean,
yeah.
Why the inconsistency?
Yeah. Look, I don't think they were actually trying to hide anything at the time. I think it's just that they knew so little about land emissions and deforestation emissions, and they knew so much about fossil fuel emissions that they saw them as chalk and cheese, and therefore the logic that they used to say, okay, you've got the deforestation emission, but it's being soaked up over here, and what remains in the atmosphere is what counts for climate. So let's use that, and that's understandable. But it's interesting what you say about replacing a tree, because, and it leads into that, because there's two arguments that support how they used to do it, the inconsistent way. And the first argument was, okay, it's what remains in the atmosphere that counts. That's the first argument. The second argument was this: fossil fuels is new carbon. What's in the biosphere, that is the atmosphere, oceans, and all living vegetation and soils, what's in the biosphere is a pool of carbon, and what's being emitted and drawn down again is called cycling within that pool. Okay? So they consider fossil fuel carbon new carbon, and they consider it's okay to treat land emissions separately or differently because it's a pool. Okay, well, here's why that's muddle-headed. There've been a lot of studies on what makes up the atmospheric composition, and where is the carbon dioxide coming from, okay? And they can look at isotopes. See the isotopes they use from vegetation are still active. And the isotopes that from fossil fuels, they've been in the ground for so long that they've fizzled out, basically. And so they can tell what comes from fossil fuels and what comes from the biosphere. And for the last decade or so, these isotope studies are telling us that 70% of the atmospheric composition is fossil carbon and 30% is a biosphere carbon. Now, if you had a time machine and you went back 200 years, you would find that most of the atmosphere was biosphere carbon and a tiny little bit was fossil carbon. Okay, so what's happening is over the years, okay, and this has been going 10,000 years, but what we've done is we've started at 1750 because that's where they measure greenhouse gases from. So let's start there. Okay, very little fossil fuels, very little for 100 years, and then it starts to go crazy. All along, you've had deforestation emissions, and that's been pretty constant, fairly constant all the way through. There was a big blip after the Second World War when we gave land to a lot of people, but we've had this constant emissions from deforestation, and we've had a recent but hugely climbing emissions from fossil fuels. So I hope I haven't confused more than anything. But what's happening now? Okay, whenever you grow a tree, the tree takes in whatever carbon it can, and that's a mix. See, the carbon is mixed through the vegetation every 1.5 years. It's a very active cycle. It doesn't sit in the atmosphere for decades. It goes through vegetation every 1.5 years. So this whole system is really active, and that's refuting a lot of the conventions as well. So what's happening is that trees are growing, and as they grow, maybe the tree's 100 years old, in which case, when it was first growing, it was taking in mostly biosphere carbon, and at the end of its growing cycle, in the last decade, it's taking in mostly fossil carbon. So what's happened is that we have this, we no longer have this carbon pool that they talk about. It's a construct that is imaginary now. What we have is a mix of carbon. So this is what I was getting at with that, was that if you chop a tree down that's been growing for, say, 10 years, what you're doing, and you burn it like they do, what you're doing is releasing mostly fossil carbon. So this biosphere pool is no more. What you've got is a pool that is biosphere plus fossil, and it's growing in fossil, but and the trees have responded. The drawdown and locking down, not just cycling, but locking down, has more than doubled since 1750. So Mother Nature has stepped up to the task, and it's soaking up all this carbon dioxide, and it's doubled the capacity. We've on Earth right now, we had 10,000 years ago 6 trillion trees. We've now got about half that, and those trees, the half that are left, now store double what used to be there. Okay, so Mother Nature has stepped up. There is carbon dioxide fertilization is true, and it's more than doubled the carbon storage. It even works for your vegetables, by the way. That's why they're not so nutritious, because they grow like crazy, but they don't have the same micronutrients. So there is no longer this biosphere pool that they argue is a thing. It's a fallacy, and fascinatingly, when you cause deforestation, depending on the age of those trees, you're actually re-releasing mostly fossil carbon. So cutting down trees, especially regrowth and especially young trees, cutting down... Sorry.
Getting excited.
Are we still alive?
We should be doing a visual episode of this.
So sorry, I get carried away. So cutting down trees of any age means you're re-releasing both fossil carbon and biosphere carbon. So there is no such thing as separate. You can't separate the two anymore. So when you're the Australian beef industry, for example, and you're arguing with the European lawmakers, oh yes, but we're only cutting down regrowth. Well, what you're doing is you're re-releasing fossil carbon. So it's in some ways probably more problematic than old growth, but it's not. All deforestation is bad. But the point is that because of the way we've been doing the sums, we minimised by 2/3. We've discounted 2/3 off deforestation emissions, and we've taken the full fossil fuel emissions. So we've been cooking the books for forever since it started. So the point with that is that if we do it consistently, not only do we show, in fact, it increases total carbon emissions by another half. Okay, so it adds a huge amount because we've been discounting it by 2/3. But not only that, we also have been discounting the amount of drawdown that's happening in the forests. And the amount of drawdown is huge. If you see, I'll talk about it. The way we do carbon accounting is so muddle-headed. On one side, we account for intact vegetation, and we account for that separately to managed vegetation, that where there's clearing and re-clearing, etc. So if you put all that together, which you can do with consistent accounting, you can put it together. And what you discover is this. First of all, the emissions are through the roof, but also the drawdown is way, way bigger than we thought. Since 1750, the biosphere, that is the oceans and the vegetation and soil carbon, has drawn down nearly 3,000 billion tonnes of carbon since 1750. Okay, which is 3/4 of all the emissions, even with the exploded emissions from deforestation, plus the full emission from fossil fuels. All of that, 3/4 have been stored, locked away in the biosphere. Now, that's not just cycling, that's locked away. So Mother Nature has been doing extraordinary things to balance out our pollution. And not only that, the amount of you might say it's different in recent history because fossil fuels are going bananas. Yes, it is different. And in the last decade, Mother Nature has still been locking down 65% of our emissions. So 2/3 of all emissions from all sources of carbon are locked down. So we've totally underestimated what Mother Nature's doing for us. And that's setting the books straight, which we're doing at this accounting, is a revelation. It's extraordinary. It exposes so many things. It places so much more value on trees, particularly forests. See, forests are extraordinary because they hold 90% of the above ground carbon. The below ground carbon storage is really slow to impact, but above ground carbon is quick. And forests hold 90% of the above ground carbon. So the more we can protect forests, and this is I guess gets on to the next question of what's the use of this accounting? And the use is this: the value of avoided deforestation and the cost of deforestation goes up by nearly 3 times. that means that all of the forest protection programs get a big boost. Carbon markets will boost their importance. Their pay went up by 3, basically. So those guys will welcome this accounting, saying, great, this is important. This is really important. Let's protect the forest. Okay, so on top of that, the global carbon budget, like I've got in the paper, I've got the diagrams based on the global carbon budget diagrams, so they can see immediately, ooh, this is different. And that's what they've responded to. They've said, yes, this needs looking at. But also, the big thing that leads on to this topic, the subject of my next paper, which is that what are the sectors driving this deforestation? And how does this impact the relative importance of each sector? So now we know that deforestation has caused more carbon emissions than fossil fuels. Okay, so what drives deforestation? Well, cities? No. Cities occupy 1% of the land. What else is there? Agriculture, forestry. Those are the two biggies. Agriculture by a long shot bigger than forestry, because normally they grow more trees with forestry. But agriculture leaves a bare landscape. So we've taken away, we've stripped 90% of the above ground carbon of that land that's now agricultural land. So you might say, well, how does this impact us? Well, we know that the way we produce food now is incredibly wasteful. We can support another 4 billion people on this planet with the crop land we've got now, let alone the grazing land. The grazing land gives us about between 1% of the fully grass-fed and 13% of the partially grass-fed ruminant animals. This is red meat and dairy. So 13% of our protein from more than a third of the planet, our most precious resource, which could be drawing down carbon and providing habitat for stopping the sixth great extinction. I think if you weigh those two up, it's a no-brainer. And when more information's out there, people will twig to that.
Now, one thing we do know is that the beef and dairy industry never really take a true account of the costs, especially the externalities, how much it's subsidized to start with. But the true costs, and here you're talking about effectively tripling the value of these trees, these forests, these native bush. Does that mean the price of beef is going to go up 3 times? Probably not, because I don't think they're taken into account to start with. But that's really where you're leading with this, aren't you? I mean, this is where the true cost of our food system needs to be accounted for.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the true cost of there've been a number of reports come out lately. The biggest one was the World Bank report from last year that looked at agricultural subsidies, and they classified agricultural subsidies as overwhelmingly harmful. And basically, it's mostly for animal production and their feed. So, and fisheries subsidies. So, yes, we need to totally revalue. They put a value on the harm that agriculture is doing to our planet, and they put a value of $12 trillion a year on the cost that are not paid, as you said, the hidden costs that the taxpayer, even the taxpayer doesn't pay sometimes, but it costs the planet. So it costs us all in the end. Every one of us will pay the cost eventually. If we get to a point where the sixth great extinction, and they're popping off, the species are popping off right now, but if we get to a point where this planet is no longer habitable to us, cost doesn't matter. It's our future we're talking about here, but the cost does go partially towards valuing that, yes. And who pays the external costs? It's very difficult.
And you mentioned before, like the importance of the drawdown of these landscapes, but especially now when there's like global concern around these big natural systems like the boreal forest in Canada and the Amazon potentially crossing over tipping points and flipping to become, sources of carbon rather than carbon sinks. The fact that we're still undervaluing the importance of this by 2.8 times is huge. So could you kind of just, what would you like to see if in a perfect world, if policymakers actually took note of this paper and changed things to gross carbon accounting across the board for everything, what would you like to see changed in terms of climate policy regarding, forest preservation and restoration efforts and flow on to the food industry?
Yeah, good question, Emma. Look, the figures in the paper are based on other people's published figures, which are known to be highly conservative. In other words, the real result for the real emissions from deforestation, carbon, are substantially higher. And there's a paper that came out last month that says the drawdown by growing vegetation, photosynthesis, we got it wrong. Photosynthesis is actually sucking out more carbon from the atmosphere than we realised. And that will have a flow, 30% more, not just a little bit, 30% more. So that will have a flow-on effect with the whole, you see, the way they do now, the way they measure the carbon flux in the biosphere is with a series of different, the most common is called a bookkeeping model, which is the area of this sort of land. It might be savanna going to crop. It might be this much forest or this canopy cover going to open grazing land, and they have areas and they have factors that they work out the emissions from. And now that we know that the total photosynthesis carbon has gone up by a third, now we'll have to revalue all of that. So the paper is very conservative, and now that conservative number is 30% conservative. So all of the land emissions and the releasing carbon that we have from the land has just gone up a notch. So it's even more important that we fix this, and that actually leads into the next paper that I'm doing. But there's another reason why it's more important too, and that is that when we burn fossil fuels, we not only release carbon dioxide, we also release cooling emissions, aerosols, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. Those aerosols have had such a strong cooling effect, they have knocked out about 3/4 of the warming from fossil fuels. So fossil fuel carbon is like discounted now against land use carbon. So deforestation becomes even more important. And this is the paper that's has been submitted, but it usually takes months for these things to come through. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, it definitely does. What do you think would be the biggest hurdles then of convincing global stakeholders to adopt this approach and take note?
The biggest hurdle, yes. This is a really good question. And this is where Kat Lawrence has done me a huge favour from Plant-Based Treaty. I was scratching my head. I'm a backroom person, right? I was scratching my head thinking maybe I should talk to people about this. And she comes along and says, you need a communication strategy, and here are some thoughts. And in her thoughts was like 3 pages of wonderful stuff I'd never thought of. So
Kat's
it ended
a
up in
genius
me.
For anyone that's listening, if she's listening, hello, Kat, you're a genius. Thank you for everything you do.
she's a powerhouse, and yeah. So that resulted in me emailing probably 200 people, and the response I've got is quite surprising. See, normally you get new science coming through like this, even though this is not new science, other people have proposed it. I'm just putting it in a way that's black and white. You can't avoid it. So it's been proposed before, but normally it takes a while. It takes years to filter through the science for the scientific reports to publish, and then maybe the intergovernmental bodies, the United Nations, and then maybe you'll have some holdouts. There'll be strong debates about it, and then maybe in 10 years' time you'll get it into the public, into the common usage. But it looks as though this is accelerating, because already I've had feedback from scientists who count that they will be looking at this in future global carbon budgets. So it might take a couple of years, but it's coming quicker than I expected. And because it's such a dry, well, it's not to me, but because it's such a dry subject to a lot of people, they might find it confusing. It's not sort of explainable easily. So it might take a little while for this to filter through the public consensus, but the next paper I'm writing will leave no doubt that we've got a new player, we've got a new figure on the board, and it's to be taken note of, and that's when I think we'll get the industry kickback and robust criticism. So these things take a while, but hopefully it's actually brighter response than I expected.
We'll have to start calling you Gerard, middle name Maverick.
Now, all this work is really highlighting the value and the importance of trees, planting trees, preserving what we have. But then there's the skeptic in me. And when you say that actually, the drawdown is exponentially more, it means for some people, they might look at it and say, well, actually, if planting a tree is 3 times the value, I'm going to continue the way I live, do what I do, because I can offset that with something even more valuable that will undo, so to speak, the bad that I'm doing, my footprint on this planet. I can now plant the same amount of trees, but actually I'm doing more good, which is not really what we want to get across. So how do we, because this is the trick with, excuse the pun, with the real science workers, how do you translate this into real world, general population information to use? How do we make people realize that actually, this is actually what we're trying to say here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ben. And that's where the rubber meets the road. What difference does this make? How will my actions count? Do they count? What can I do to leverage this? And nothing changes, really. We always knew that planting trees is good, but to go back and to an earlier question of yours, you talked about, yes, but the system's faltering. Some areas are starting, with the big bushfires, are starting to release carbon rather than store them, and the Amazon is teetering, having its first droughts in the last decade, first ever droughts. Yes, but despite that, globally, the forests are still soaking down 2/3 of all carbon emitted. It's huge what they're doing. We've got no concept of how such a strong ally they are for us in the carbon fight. So just to clarify what you're saying, the value of avoided deforestation and deforestation increases by nearly 3 times. However, the value of tree planting does not increase, because when we plant out a hectare of this certain species, we know how much carbon is stored. That value is actually growing, but it's growing slowly because that will have carbon dioxide fertilisation. So the value of that stand will increase over decades, but the whole world is increasing over decades. All the trees are joining together and let's fight this thing. Okay, but to get back to your question, what can I do? Okay, well, there's a lot of naysayers out there now. You've got Elon Musk saying, doesn't matter, don't worry about trees, don't worry about what you eat, it's not going to make any difference. What they fail to understand is that, yes, doing tree planting as we are right now, even including China's incredibly huge program, which dwarfs all other national programs in the world, even including that, our tree planting is minimal. It's infinitesimal. What we need to do is harness nature, and we can do way like multi times better if we can harness nature. And I'll give you an idea. There was a paper published about 12 years ago that looked at the vegetation of sub-Saharan Africa. And they looked at, okay, what is the vegetation there now and what is the peak vegetation? What could be there? And they worked out that all we've got to do to double the forest area in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, all they need to do is stop burning. You see, Africa burns every year. The northern half of Australia burns every year. South America burns every year. And it goes up on the steppe into the stands and Russia, etc. We all burn to get rid of the old long grass, to kill off the ticks, and to make way for the new green pick that the animals love to eat. So that burning is just huge. It's 3 million square kilometres every year. It's an area the size of India is burned every year. We do it with drip torches. Now in Australia, it's done out of a helicopter, sometimes on a quad bike. But we burn, baby, burn, the whole lot. And if we were to stop doing that, we would harness nature. And you see, they call them woody weeds. It's really interesting. They advocate burning the savanna because then you get rid of woody weeds. Well, what's a woody weed? It's a tree sapling. So, in other words, if they weren't burning, it would be a different forest cover. So, burning, as the Australian Aboriginals have done for millennia, they burn to change the landscape. And we've been changing the landscape on a far greater scale than they ever did. But if we stopped doing that, then we could harness nature, and it would be many, many thousands times more potent than planting a tree. So why do we do that burning? For red meat production. Simple. Grass-fed. So shut down grass-fed industries will release more than a third of the planet back to habitat, where if we stopped the burning or made sure the burning stopped, we could regrow those forests, same as Northern Australia, right around the world. Harnessing nature is by far the most effective thing we could do. But the other thing we can do, most of the world's crops, 2/3 of the world's crops by biomass, that is the weight of the produce, 2/3 of the world's produced biomass goes to feed animals. I mean, for example, palm oil. The oil is used in everything, but the palm kernels are used as stock feed. So, and that applies to all of the oil seeds, like canola oil, soybeans. If they use it for that, they normally use the whole bean these days to feed to China's pigs, basically. But yeah, we can change. We won't need the same amount of crops even to feed the world. We can change a third of the planet, 37% of the land surface, change it back to its native vegetation and let it go, baby, and it will go crazy, much greater than. So to answer your question, what's more effective, planting a tree or changing your diet? Absolutely changing your diet every time. But we still need to plant trees.
So it really highlights the importance of choosing what you put on your plate. And the food on your plate has a direct, I mean, it kind of wraps up the action point out of this conversation, the real science. What can we do? As you said, it's okay. We've spoken 50 minutes, 55 minutes about trees, but yet what we're really saying is change what you're eating. And that will make a significant impact. That's really almost the crux of the matter here.
Absolutely. So when Elon Musk says, don't worry about trees, what they fail to understand is that he's talking about doing trees on the planting level. He's talking about what effect we are having by planting trees, and it's minimal, even with China's efforts. But what he fails to understand is that if we step out of the way, nature will just go bananas, and the amount of land that's needed to soak up our excesses is there. It's there. We just need to step out of the way. And he doesn't understand, as most people in this space do not think that we can seriously change land use. But we can by what we eat.
And look, and I can't really speak for Australia as much, but in parts of New Zealand where 100 years ago, parts of the land was heavily logged and mined for gold, especially, and since abandoned. Beautiful new growth. I mean, can you call 100 years old new growth now? But nature reclaims, and the abundance is back. So that's a perfect example of how nature can self-regenerate and clean the waterways and recover the land, the bare land with beautiful trees and bushes, and bring the ecosystems back. So it is possible just by stopping and letting that land reclaim itself.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah. Everything changes if we let nature go. We fix the biodiversity crisis, we fix the climate crisis, we fix the water cycles crisis, we fix the nitrogen pollution crisis. We fix all of these things that are stacking up. As I said before, the planetary boundaries that we've overstepped, and there's 6 of them. The greatest driver has been agriculture. We can reverse that, all of them.
Gerard, thank you so much again for your hugely insightful and, we've said it a few times, dry, geeky. It's people like you that really, you do the hard work, the real insight to bring out the simplicity that we need in terms of the actual action that we can be taken, but at least it's backed by science. So we really sincerely appreciate the amazing work that you do, and this has been probably one of those episodes we'll have to re-listen to really let things sink in a little bit, but hugely insightful. So we hugely appreciate your time and effort, and it's been an absolute treat to have you back on the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben and Emma. It's been a delight. Thank you for getting me back.
And we'll look forward to plugging the next paper when it comes out, for sure.
Yes. I'll let you know because the debate about that one is going to be robust.
And we look forward to having a mini debate online too. So until then, Gerard, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. And Emma, thanks very much.